It would have been a Sabbath like any other Sabbath at the synagogue on that day. All the women were sitting on their side, and all the men were sitting on their side. And among the women who were there was one woman who had been bowed double for 18 years and unable to stand up straight. She would have been a familiar figure in the synagogue. Everyone knew her. Those synagogues were really quite small. Everyone knew everyone. And of course, someone like that, your heart goes out to them. And I have little doubt that many people prayed for her on a regular basis. But on this particular occasion, the man who was sitting and teaching, because you sat to teach in the synagogue, was none other than Jesus of Nazareth. And he looked at the woman and called her over to him, which might or might not have been a thing that should have been done, but he doesn't seem to have cared very much about what should have been done. He called her over to him, and he gently laid his hands on her, and he said, "Woman, you're loosed from your infirmity." And she stood up straight for the first time in 18 years. Now, I would have assumed, I don't know, I mean, we're a different time, a different place, but if we did something like that today among us, I think there would all be oohs and ahs and probably clapping hands and praising God. And this woman stood up, she started praising God right off the bat. She was profoundly moved by what had happened to her. It's hard to imagine what it would have meant to her to have been loosed in this particular way. It was a wonderful day in the synagogue, except for the reaction of one man, the arché of the synagogue, the ruler of the synagogue, or really chief of the synagogue, more or less, something along the lines of the president of the synagogue. He was indignant, and he scolded the people. You shouldn't be coming in here on the Sabbath day to be healed. There are 6 days in which people can be healed. You know, he says this as though they'd been healing 2 people on Monday and 3 on Wednesday and 4 on Friday, and then we have some more next week coming along. I'll bet there hadn't been a healing in that synagogue in who knows how long. And here this woman is healed on this singular occasion, and all he can do is be aware of the fact that somebody broke a rule. Somebody broke a rule. The rule is you're not supposed to be healed on the Sabbath day. We don't heal people on the Sabbath day around here. We only heal them 6 days a week, and we don't do that on the 7th day of the week. Now, the man's reaction was probably a knee-jerk reaction. He did not think before he spoke, but he was the boss in the synagogue, and he started scolding everybody and says, don't do this. There are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them, therefore, come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. And the Lord answered him. And I think probably in the vernacular of their day, it would have been, oh, give me a break. You know, what are you talking about? You hypocrite, doesn't every one of you on the Sabbath day, every one of you, it's an agricultural community, wouldn't you, Rabbi, go out on the Sabbath day, loose your ox, untie your ass, and lead them down to the water and let them drink on the Sabbath day? You'd do that, wouldn't you? Then he asked this question. Ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, lo, these many years, 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? And when he said this thing, all his adversaries, that's an interesting word, isn't it? He had adversaries in that synagogue. All his adversaries were ashamed, and all the people rejoiced for the glorious things that were done by him on that day. Now, it's fascinating to me that on this particular occasion, everybody pretty well had to shut up. There was not much left to say. But it's also striking that a teacher like Jesus, a teacher who could straighten up a woman who'd been bowed over for 18 years, still had adversaries on this day. He had people that no matter what he said to them, they were going to disagree with him. No matter what he advocated, they were going to take the opposite position, that they were going to oppose Jesus almost no matter what he did. It's really striking to consider the milieu, the environment in which Jesus worked and operated, and the effect that it had on the people that he met, which was very different from person to person. Some people loved him. Some people worshiped the ground he walked on. Some people hated him with a passion that is very difficult to fathom. Another scripture in Luke, this one, by the way, if you want to look it up later, is in Luke 13, but another one in Luke in chapter 4 is interesting. Jesus came down to Capernaum, and we're about verse 31, I think. came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he taught them on the Sabbath days. Notice the plural. It implies that he comes to the synagogue on a regular, continuing basis and teaches there. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for his word was with power. And there was in the synagogue, there was a man who had a spirit of an unclean devil, and he cried out with a loud voice. Now this is in synagogue on the Sabbath day. This man jumps up. I don't know if anybody knew what his problem was or where it came from, but he was there. And he jumps up and saying, "Let us alone. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? What are you here for? To destroy us? I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God." Imagine this. This guy's up there screaming at the top of his voice, pointing fingers at Jesus. "I know who you are. I know who you are. What are you here for? Are you come here to destroy us?" And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Shut up and get out of him. Come out of that man." And it happened. The devil threw him down in the middle of them and came out of him, but didn't harm the man. And they were all amazed. And they spoke among themselves, saying, "What is this? What a word is this? For with authority and with power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out." You know, we look back, we read the Bible, and we see through a glass darkly, as it were, trying to grasp what happened and what it meant and how he affected people. And it's hard to imagine the disruption of somebody standing up, screaming and yelling and pointing the finger at it. I had that happen to me once, actually, some years ago, when toward the end of one of my sermons, some guy got up, jumped up in the back row and started walking forward, pointing his finger and yelling at the top of his voice, something. The couple of deacons picked him up by the elbows and carried him out to the parking lot. And I don't really know what happened to him after that. But it kind of gets to you a little bit when somebody jumps up, and I didn't know what it was. Jesus knew immediately what he was dealing with and handled it and dealt with it. And people saw this, and the fame of him went out into every place of the country round about. And he arose out of the synagogue, and he entered Simon's house. Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great fever, and they asked him for her sake. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she arose and ministered to them. And then verse 40 is interesting. Now when the sun was setting, all they that had any sick with divers diseases brought them to him, and he laid his hands on every one of them and healed them. Every one. But what's fascinating to me is all these poor people waited until the Sabbath day was over to come to Jesus to be healed. Not because he wouldn't heal on the Sabbath, but because they believed and been taught. The rules were, it's wrong to do that. So, they were healed. Devils came out of many of them, crying out and saying, "You're the Christ, you're the Son of God." They all knew who he was immediately. And he rebuked them and wouldn't permit them to speak because they knew he was the Christ. And when it was day, he departed to a desert place, and people sought him and came to him and stayed him that he should not depart from them. There were people who followed Jesus, begged him to stay around, looked to him on every side. And there were people who wanted to kill him. Those two categories we ran into all the time. In Luke 14, it came to pass, Luke 14, verse 1, he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day. And they watched him. And there was a certain man before him who had the dropsy. And Jesus, answering, spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees. Because this was a continuing issue with him. The whole idea of the way in which they had built a fence around the law having to do with the Sabbath day, to try to avoid even any accidental breaking of the Sabbath day, their complete and comprehensive set of rules of what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath day were offensive to Jesus. And he actually looked for occasions to challenge it, not because he wanted to do away with the Sabbath day, but because they had the whole totally wrong idea about the Sabbath day. So he asked them, here they are, you got theologians here, Pharisees, lawyers. He wants to know, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? They held their peace. They wouldn't say anything, wouldn't answer him. So Jesus took him and healed him and let him go. And he answered them, saying, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? This is a lot more now than just watering the animal. This animal's fallen in a pit. And it's going to involve hard physical labor to get that animal out of there. Which of you, if that doesn't happen, Won't you go down there and pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him on these questions. Jesus kept provoking, kept challenging the conventional wisdom about the Sabbath day and healing, and as one, just only part of the many things that he was dealing with in these men, to demonstrate once and again that God only has the power to heal. And God has the power to heal on the Sabbath day and chooses to exercise it on the Sabbath day. What are we supposed to say about it? But it's interesting. It isn't that they didn't want to answer him. They couldn't. It wasn't that they believed him. They couldn't answer him. It wasn't that they realized that they were wrong and admitted they were wrong and glorified God and said, look what has happened and look what a marvelous miracle is. They went out of there gritting their teeth because they couldn't answer what Jesus did. Matthew 12, verse 9, another occasion. When Jesus left there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man there who had his hand withered. And for some reason, this particular miracle of Jesus hangs in my mind at all times because the drama of it, the visibility of this. A guy's lying on the bed sick, or maybe he's a bit lame and gets up and walks. If a man has a fever and you heal him, people could kind of say, well, it's just time for him to get over the fever broke. He wasn't really healed. But this one, everybody knew this man, just like the woman he'd straightened out. He'd been in the synagogue for years, and everybody had seen him walk around with a withered hand. And I guess one of the reasons this hits me in the way that it does is because in my years, when I was a boy really, there were people that I knew, more than one, who actually had a withered arm or a withered leg. I don't know if it was polio or what it was, but the limb was just like a stick that they held close to the body. There was not much they could do. It was just there, a claw, as it were. And the whole arm was all dried up. And so the visibility of this, the man is here. He could roll up his robe and the arm is there for everybody to look at and to see what's happening in this case. So they asked Jesus on this occasion. He'd asked before, now they ask, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Because they were looking for something to accuse him on. Mind you, looking for something to accuse him on. And he said to them, what man is there among you that having one sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? Now, I want you to understand something at this point. I feel sorry for animals as much as anything. I'll go out of my way to be tender to an animal. I hate to see animals suffer and so forth. But Paul in one place talks about not muzzling the ox that treads out the corn, and he asks this question. He says, does God really care about oxen? And the implicit answer is obviously not. The idea that Jesus is advancing here and reminding these people of, this is not a matter of tender care for the animal, because if that were all it was, they would have easily have understood the idea of tender care for a living human being, wouldn't they? But you see, if you've got a sheep in a pit on the Sabbath day, and you don't do something about it, and you lose that animal, what have you lost? Money. Money. If you don't water your animal on the Sabbath day, that animal may not give milk when the day is over. You may actually create a situation where the animal can get mastitis if it's a cow. You could create all sorts of problems for your critters if you don't water your critters regularly. You can damage their health. Damage the health, you lose the animal, you lose the money. It was an economic matter that all of them understood. We can go water our animals on the Sabbath day. And Jesus keeps challenging them with this fundamental principle. Well, if a cow, if an ass, if a sheep, why not a man? Especially when all Jesus had to do was say the word. He didn't have to perform surgery. He didn't have to do any work. He just had to say the word. And he did on this occasion. Took the man, healed him, and let him go. Actually, one of the other accounts of them tells him, well, you had the man stretch out your hand, hold your hand out, and the man did it, and it was restored just like the other one. Now, what are you going to do with that? Because Jesus didn't even say be healed. Jesus didn't touch him. Jesus didn't lay hands on him. All he said was, wrap your hands around behind your back and looked at the man and say, stretch your arm out. And this man with his withered, dried up clod was able to stretch his hand, and right in front of the eyes of everybody in that synagogue, the whole arm, hand, and everything was restored perfectly. What do they think about that? The Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they could destroy him. And you could even make the case he didn't heal the guy, because he didn't do anything. He just told the man, stretch out your arm. And the man stretched his arm out, and the arm was healed. Now, this is fascinating. The whole story and the sequence of these things is fascinating. And in John 5, there's another one of these instances that's interesting in this regard. In John 5 and verse 1, after this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. There is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool called Bethesda, having 5 porches. And I think we get the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C. gets its name from this pool. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water, and the first person in was healed. Now there was a man there. This man had had an infirmity for 38 years. 38 years. A lot of people in this room haven't got that far in life yet. 38 years this man had been this way. And Jesus saw him, and he knew how long he had been there. He said, would you like to be made whole? Now the man who was lying there looked up at him, and never occurred to him what was coming down. Because his immediate thought was, well, yes, I would like to be made whole, but I don't have anybody to put me in the pool because the water gets troubled, and as soon as I try to get down there to get into the water, somebody gets there before me, and it's only the first person in that gets healed. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your bed, walk. And the man was made whole immediately, picked up his bed, walked. His bed couldn't have been anything more than just a rolled up pallet that he stuck under his arm and walked off. Now, when people saw them, this is the same day as the Sabbath day. The problem was, it wasn't lawful by the Pharisees' rules and regulations for him to carry his bed on the Sabbath day. He couldn't carry that pallet. He had to actually bring that pallet down there before the Sabbath day in order to be there on the Sabbath day. It was unlawful for him to carry it. They said, don't do that. And he answered them, he that made me whole, the same said to me, take up your bed and walk. I mean, I can almost hear him say, what do you expect me to tell him? He's the guy that made me whole. He said, pick up my bed and walk. You mean to tell him? I'm not going to do that. I'd be breaking a rule. Well, hardly. As far as he was concerned, anybody that could heal him in this way had the authority to tell him to pick up his bed. He did it. They asked him, what man said this to you? Take up your bed and walk. And what's interesting is the man who was healed didn't know. He didn't know who Jesus was. He didn't know what he looked like. He didn't know his name. He knew nothing. He didn't even have any faith in Jesus to be healed. So why do you think Jesus did this? It was a deliberate, in-your-face provocation of the Pharisees on the issue of healing on the Sabbath and their stupid little laws about what you could carry and what you couldn't carry on the Sabbath day. It's a direct provocation of these men. That's why he did it here and now. I'm sure he also felt sorry for the man, but he could have healed him quietly and caused no trouble at all. He wanted to cause problems. Anyway, he didn't know because Jesus had gotten away from the crowd. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple, and he said to him, look, you're made whole. Sin no more, unless you wind up in worse shape than you were before. And the man went to the Jews and told them, it was Jesus who did this and made me whole. And therefore, the Jews did persecute Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Wanted to kill him. But Jesus answered, my Father works hitherto, and I work. And then they sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath in their eyes, he hadn't broken the Sabbath before God, he had before them, but also said that God was his Father, making himself in their eyes equal with God. And so on it goes. Again and again and again, Jesus faces this mob, this gang of people, performs a miracle, that cannot be denied, and all they want to do as a result of it is to kill him. Turn back to John, if you would, the 9th chapter. John chapter 9. Because this is one of the really, really fascinating encounters of this type of Jesus. John chapter 9. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man which had been blind from the day he was born, never had seen in his life. Now they tell me that a lot of the seeing that goes on in a person goes on in the brain. It is that it isn't just the eyes that see, the brain actually sees based upon what the eyes send it. And that if a person had been blind all these years, that we have to learn to see, in other words, that merely healing the eyes would not enable a blind man to see. That he has to be healed right through the head, as it were. His brain and his eyes. A great miracle has to take place for a man who was born blind to be able to see, and for what he sees to even mean anything to him. This poor man, he'd never seen his mother's face, never seen a sunrise, never seen a blue sky, never seen a bird fly, had never seen any of this. His disciples asked him, "Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" The assumption in those days was that if you were sick, you'd done something wrong. If you were fat, God had blessed you. If you had a lot of money, God had blessed you. If you were poor, God had cursed you. If you were skinny and emaciated, like some people like to try to be today, to live longer, God, you're under a curse from God. That was the assumption many people made. Jesus answered, "That has nothing to do with it. Neither his man nor his parents sinned on this thing, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. I have to work the works of him that sent me while it's day. The night is coming when no man can work." I was listening to my own program yesterday, and it was going over this particular scripture, and it really struck me to realize, what are you saying here? We only have a limited amount of time to get done what we have to do. We've got to get after this because the night is coming when we can't do these things. So the need for movement, for accomplishment is there. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, when he said this, bear in mind now, this is also the Sabbath day. He spit on the ground, he made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Now this time, he is doing something. This time he's doing work. He's actually not like a mason, he gets clay, puts water in it, makes a clay out of it, and then puts it on the man's eyes. And he said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." He went his way, therefore, and he washed, and he came back seeing. I cannot even imagine what it was like for this man, never to have seen anything. And now he sees everything. The neighbors, therefore, that before had seen him that was blind, says, "Isn't that the guy who sat over there and was a beggar, a blind beggar?" And someone said, "Yeah, that's him." Other people said, No, it isn't him. It can't be him. It looks like him, but it's not him." And he spoke up and he said, "I'm the guy. I'm the man. It was me. I see." And they say, "Well, how were your eyes opened?" He said, "Well, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash.' And I went and washed, and I received my sight." And they said, "Where is he?" He says, "I don't know." Well, then they brought him to the Pharisees. It was on the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and put it on his eyes. So the Pharisees said, "How did you receive your sight?" He said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, I washed, I can see." Then some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath day." This is a really interesting situation. Here is a man. Put yourself in the position of the poor man who'd been born blind. Now he can see. Jesus made the clay, put it on his eyes, said, "Go wash," and he came seeing. He never seen Jesus even yet himself because he was in the pool of Siloam when he started seeing and coming back. And he's back here, and he's standing in front of these Pharisees, and he looks at and sees the Pharisees as a result of a miracle Jesus did, and they said, "This man is not of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath day." Now, of course, we all know Jesus did keep the Sabbath day. It's just that he didn't keep the Sabbath day by their rules. He didn't see it the same way they did. The other people said, "Well, how can a man that is a sinner do miracles like this?" And there was a division among them. Some people saw it, some people did not. So they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him that opened your eyes? The man himself said, I guess he's a prophet. But the Jews wouldn't believe it that he had been blind. They thought, this is a fake. Can't be true. And so they called the parents of him that had received his sight. Called him mother and dad, got his mother and dad in there. And they said, is this your son who was born blind? How does he now see? As though the parents were responsible for this terrible thing. His parents answered and said, I can tell you this is my boy. I can tell you he was born blind. But how he sees, or who has opened his eyes, we don't know. He's of age. Ask him. He can speak for himself. And then John includes this little piece of information. The parents said this because they feared the Jews. Because the Jews had already said that if any man confessed that he was Christ, that Jesus was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he's of age, ask him, distancing themselves from him. So they called him back in again. They said, give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. Let's just give God the praise. And he says, well, whether he be a sinner or no, I don't know. I can't tell you that. Can't testify on that. I know one thing. I was blind. Now I can see. And so they said, well, now, what did he do? How did he open your eyes? Because what they wanted to do, they wanted to get it in the record that Jesus had made the clay and the spittle. They wanted to be sure they had it down so they could accuse him of breaking the Sabbath day. But this guy, I have to like this guy. I really do. You really have to like his response to this. He says, well, I've told you already, and you didn't hear it. You want to hear it again? Are you going to be his disciples? Now, I'm as sure as I am that I'm standing here that he was being sarcastic at this point. He was not really thinking for 1 minute they were going to be Jesus' disciples or that they were sincere. I think he was smarting off to them, and they thought so too, because they reviled him. And they said, you're his disciple. We're Moses' disciples. We know God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he came from. And the man said to them, why, herein, and he's still being sarcastic. He is not really ready to roll over at all. He said, why, herein is a marvelous thing. You don't know where he came from, and he has opened my eyes. That, he says, is amazing. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. If any man is a worshiper of God and does his will, God hears him. Since the world began, it was not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind. If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And they answered and said, you were altogether born in sins, and you're going to teach us. And they threw him out of the synagogue. Now, I've told you all this today to point out one thing, really, and just basically one thing only. At the end of Jesus' ministry, after all that he had taught, all the miracles he had performed, this man is obviously a charismatic person who is a persuasive person. His ability to teach from the law was phenomenal. People loved to listen to him teach. At the end of all of the time of his ministry, he had the grand total of 120 disciples who stayed with him through the whole thing. I think about this every time I go through the feeding of the 5,000 and the events that took place following that, to realize that when it came down to it, on the day of Pentecost, after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, when the Holy Spirit came down, there were 120 total disciples, and that was all. And here's the thing. If people were not persuaded by Jesus' teaching, why should we be surprised that they aren't persuaded by us? If people saw the incredible healings of Jesus and remained unpersuaded of him, why should we be surprised if people are unpersuaded by our arguments? That we can marshal our scriptures, we can lay out our reasoning, we can present our logic, we can show the biblical authority for all the things that we believe, and we can do a thorough job of explain. Why should we be surprised at the end of all that explanation that some people see it and some people don't? And not only that, some people are mad because you told them. Why should we be surprised? Jesus said the servant is not greater than his Lord. They persecuted me, they'll persecute you. But you know, there's just something that goes on in people's minds and in their hearts. And when you realize this, you just have to deal with it. Now, Paul, being the great debater that he was, he couldn't break through. So many of the Jews, the vast majority of the Jews he went to and talked to, he could not break through on these people. And it bothered him profoundly. That entire section from Romans 9 on through chapter 11 is Paul's lament in a way. It's Paul's analysis of what happened to him as he preached and taught to the Jews, and they turned it down. And the Gentiles came in by droves, and he is trying his best to understand what happened, why it happened, and where it was going. But it was very, very troubling to the Apostle Paul. And there's an incident in his ministry that represents, I think, a kind of turning point for Paul. And there was a day when he was preaching in one of the synagogues. You find it in Acts chapter 13. He'd been preaching in the synagogue, and the Jews sort of sat there and listened, and some may have argued and so forth. Paul was a very powerful debater. Some may not have wanted to challenge him on it. I don't know. But he went through all this, and finally the service was over, and the Jews had gone out of the synagogue. You'll find it in Acts 13, verse 42. The Gentiles begged Paul that he would preach the same words to them the next Sabbath day. We want to know more about this. We'd like to have it in greater detail. And when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. And the next Sabbath day, almost the whole city came together to hear the word of God. I mean, the word had spread, and those Gentiles, they wanted to know, and they came in there by the droves to hear what Paul had to say. When the Jews saw the multitude, they were filled with envy and spoke against those things that were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. So here we are again. If Jesus couldn't persuade them, why should we think we're going to have any better luck? If Paul got this kind of reaction from some people, why should we be surprised if we get this kind of reaction from some people? Some will listen, some people won't. And there's not much you can do about it when all says that. And it's not a question of the cleverness of your arguments. It really isn't. It is a matter of whether or not that person is ready to hear or whether they're not, and whatever their motivations are. We now know precisely what the big problem was with the Jews at this time. It was envy in no uncertain terms. Paul was successful where they had not been. So finally, Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said this: it was necessary that the word of God should first have been spoken to you. But seeing you put it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. For so has the Lord commanded us, saying, I have set you to be a light to the Gentiles, that you should be for salvation to the ends of the earth. He came to a place to where he said, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. We have nothing more to discuss. You have decided what you're going to do and the direction you're going to go, and I can't be bothered with it anymore. From this day forward, I am turning to the Gentiles, which was, of course, one of the primary things that God intended for him to do anyway. I get the feeling with Paul that it took him a little longer than it might have taken for this lesson to really sink in on him, that he was supposed to be going to the Gentiles. You have this really fascinating and longish section in Romans where he talks about the olive tree and how he says it was necessary that we break out the old branches. We had to break off the old branches to make room so the Gentiles could be grafted into this tree. And it's interesting to me to think about what Paul says in Romans there about this question of almost the casting away, the getting rid of the Jews, the brushing of them aside, which in a sense is what Paul does on this day. He says, hey, you don't want it, you don't have to have it. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. And away he went. And it was as though the branches were all broken out of the tree to make room for the Gentiles. For if Paul had continued to debate and to argue and to debate and to argue with these Jews Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath, what would the result have been? Nothing. Nothing but argument and words. And I had a very good friend once upon a time who told me this, and I have concluded that it is true. If the devil can't get at you any other way, he will waste your time. And if Paul had continued to try to argue with these people, he would have been wasting precious, valuable time that needed to be turned and addressed to those people who did want the word and were ready to receive it and ready to change their lives. There is, the point I think that I'm driving at in this sermon, there is a grave danger that in continuing to pursue people who remain unpersuaded, that we will neglect people who are starving for the gospel and who want it more than words could ever tell you. I believe in a way there is a strong parallel between the Jews of Paul's day and the religious people of our own day, the religionists, as I would put it, the church people, who will argue till the cows come home about doctrines. And it's interesting that I have just now, as we are really getting deeply into the words of Jesus in the daily program, begun to get some hostile doctrinal type of emails starting to come in. I haven't had that many letters yet, but the emails are starting to roll in. And it's interesting to it. You know, I can see very quickly how easy it would be, reading the email, to get involved in a debate with this guy and to totally and completely waste my time. Fortunately, because I understand the lesson I'm trying to give you today, I don't do that. If this guy is in an argumentative spirit, if he's just, in one of these put-down modes, he gets a courtesy email back from me that I heard from him, thank him for caring enough to write, and that's all he gets, and it's all he ever will get. Because I don't have time for that. If the devil can't get at you any other way, he will waste your time. But on the other hand, there are the people who come and say, you said something on the program that I don't understand. And they ask a question. I have all the time in the world for a person like that. And I don't feel that I should ever allow the arguing and bickering and the people who want to argue religion to interfere with the teaching of new people the Bible would call little ones who want to understand the truth of God. Now, this is where I stand, and I think it's where you should all stand as well, that nothing is more pointless than arguing religion. Nothing. It's just utterly and completely pointless. Basically, you shrug your shoulders and say, really, that's what you believe, and then go on to something else, because the person that you're going to ultimately be able to help will not have that kind of an argumentative, bickering, hard-nosed spirit, and when you detect it, and with the Holy Spirit in you, you ought to be able to detect it. You have to make a decision, like doctors make a decision in triage, to not fool with that person. And that's true of people who are members of some church here or somewhere who have a doctrinal belief they want to argue with you about. It's true of all of these some of these ideas about trying to get the churches back together and to reconcile people and so forth. There are people who want to reconcile with them. And the rest of them, leave them alone. It won't do you a bit of good to pursue any of that kind of thing, because the barriers have been so high in their own minds, you will never be able to transcend them or get across them. John 10, Jesus says this, Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that enters not by the door to the sheepfold, but comes up some other way is a thief and a robber. He that enters in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep, the guy that comes straight forward, doesn't pretend or come around the sides. To him the porter opens, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And when he puts out his own sheep and goes before them, the sheep follow him because, look at what he says, because they know his voice. Now, I want to tell you something that's very interesting to me, and I've got a lot of years behind me of learning this lesson, and I've been very slow to pick up on it at times, that I encounter people all the time who know his voice and people who don't. I just do. There are people, when you open up the Bible, show them something out of the Bible, they say, well, look at that. They recognize. It registers with them. There are other people who look at the same thing. You might as well have shown them something that's written in an entirely different language for all of the information that actually crosses into their mind or in their head. They don't know the voice. So out there There are people who, if called, would recognize the voice, would respond to the voice. Jesus said they won't follow a stranger. They'll flee from him. They'll run from him. They don't know the voice of strangers. Jesus spoke this parable unto them, but they didn't understand what he was saying. He said again, I'm telling you, I'm the door of the sheep. Everybody that came besides me is a thief and a robber. But the sheep wouldn't listen. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved and shall go in and out and find pasture. The thief, he's only here to kill and destroy. I'm come that they may have life and have life more abundantly. I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. He that's a hireling gets his pay, and not the shepherd. He doesn't care. He sees the wolf coming and leaves them and runs for himself, and the wolf catches them and scatters the sheep. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and doesn't care for the sheep. I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep and am known of mine. My sheep know me, he says. He goes on to say, as the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And consider this, I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I have to bring them too. They shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. And what he's talking about here is the Gentiles, that there are all kinds of people. He says, I have, present tense, other sheep that aren't here. I got to go get those other sheep and bring them because there's going to be one fold and one shepherd. We're not going to have a Gentile fold and a Jewish fold. There's going to be one, and that's all. Now, people either recognize the voice of Jesus in the message or they don't recognize it. Our job is to be sure that those people who are God's get a chance to hear his voice. And that's the tricky part of it. Now, there was another occasion with Paul, which I think is very revealing and might help us to understand something. I've mentioned this passage before. I mentioned it again in this context. Acts 18, verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila. He had been born in Pontus and lately had come over from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So he joined in with them, and because he was of the same craft, a tent maker, he abode with them and worked. There by their occupation they were tent makers. So he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath day and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, up until this time, what Paul did was essentially argue the law with the Jews in the synagogue. But when they came down, he was pressed in the Spirit, and he testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And when they opposed themselves, that means basically when they set themselves in opposition and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said to them, your blood be on your own head. From henceforth, I'm going to the Gentiles. And he departed, and he entered into a certain house of a man named Justus, one that worshiped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. Crispus, the chief ruler of this synagogue, actually believed on the Lord with all of his house, and many of the Corinthians, and I think by that he means non-Jews, believed and were baptized. And then something really remarkable happened. The Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision, and he said, don't be afraid. Speak. Don't hold your peace, for I am with you, and no man shall set on you to hurt you, for I have much people in this city. These are the sheep that they were supposed to go out. And I've said all that to you today to try to underline for us a very important truth, that we're not going to create these sheep. We're not going to create these disciples by argumentation. We're not going to create them by persuasion, although God knows we need to know the Scriptures, we need to be able to present them, we need to be able to explain the truth to people so they will understand it. But we are not going to create sheep by argumentation or by persuasion or by logic or by lists of Scriptures that we can quote for them. Because you can do that to your heart's content, and you will never get results unless you're talking to someone who will recognize the voice. And there's a difference. And I think it's crucial that we in the church today, in this generation in which we live, have got to realize that we have an adversary out there who will do everything in his power to waste our time. And when people won't listen, and when they won't hear, and when their mind is made up, and when they've created barriers between us that they aren't willing to take down, all you can do is leave them alone. Strictly alone. And turn your heart and turn your attention elsewhere. As I said, there's a parallel in a lot of ways between the Jews of Paul's day and the church of today in some ways. And frankly, to many of us who are involved in the work that we are trying to do, like Paul, we have come to a point where it's time, I think, to shake our garments and said, now we turn to the Gentiles. We have to go looking for those people who will recognize the voice and who will respond to it. Because Paul went on in Romans to tell us this, that the time is coming out in front of us when God will do something about those people that we can't persuade now. That it will be his job, his task, he will have to do it, for it is beyond our capacity. We have all we can do to see to it that those scattered sheep of God out here in the world, whoever they are, hear the voice and get a chance to recognize the voice that they know. There was a day when Peter made a statement. He opened his mouth to Cornelius when he was down seeing Cornelius. It's in Acts 10. He said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that fears him and works righteousness is accepted of him. And out there are people in their dozens, people in their hundreds, and people in their thousands who do love God, who want to love God, and who want to do works of righteousness. But in so many cases, they just don't know how. Let's not waste our time on people who don't care, and look for those people who really do.